Well, welcome everybody. This is one of my favorite stories. Love these stories. And it's part of the triple tradition. That is, it's a story that's in all the synoptic gospels in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And it's a miracle story. And in fact, it's the last miracle story, last miracle in the book. And it does invite comparison to the first miracle. And just the context of the story, just before this story, the disciples are asking Jesus for special favors. And um, John reminds us that the disciples represent that part of us who, even though they see, are blind. So it really, right from the beginning, by context, we're distinguishing physical sight from spiritual sight, from the ability to see the phenomenal world in space and time versus the world of love and truth. Helen Keller, dear old Helen Keller, said it best: the best and most beautiful things in the world cannot be seen or heard or touched, but are felt in the heart. Now, the thing that happens just after this story, Jesus is on his third trip to Jerusalem, and the very next event is Palm Sunday. So here we are. We're in preparation. We're preparing for Holy Week or Passion Week, and we all know what happens that week. It's a very simple story. We have a blind beggar sitting on a road, surrounded by a crowd, and he encounters Jesus. But however simple it appears, it's a transformation. It's a miracle of wholeness. And I mean, I think we should read it the same way. We have the possibility of becoming whole, of experiencing something, learning something where our life can be transformed. And right now, tonight, I'm just going to be talking about the road and the crowd and a little bit about Bartimaeus. But on Sunday, it's really the difference between studying something, talking about something, knowing something, versus actually experiencing an encounter with Jesus. And I'm going to try to do this in half an hour, so we have some time for discussion. And I want to spend some time on the first verse, really, because it's the point of departure. It kind of sets up the whole story. Verse 46, and I hope you have the text with you. And it's got two key words, both proper nouns, Jericho and Bartimaeus. And they're each mentioned twice. It's practically screaming out, listen, these are important words. Don't miss them. They came to Jericho as he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho. So Jericho is a famous town. It's a crossroads. There's a north-south route from the Galilee down to the Dead River and Point South. And then there's an east-west route from Philadelphia and the King's Highway to Jerusalem. So it's a commercial route, it's a trading route, it's a pilgrimage route, and it does claim to be the oldest continuously occupied city in the world. It's just it's near the river, Jordan River, where Jesus was baptized, and Herod died there. But what's the theological association? The most common association that people would have is the Battle of Jericho, which is sort of like Waterloo or Dunkirk or D-Day. It's a pivotal battle which determined the outcome of the war and the ability of the Jewish people to reclaim their land once again. And this battle was won by General Joshua. Now, the name Joshua that we read in the Old Testament, the Hebrew name is Yeshua. And the Greek word, Jesus is a translation into Greek of the word Yeshua. So they both have the same name. And this is right where people are at. This is exactly what people are looking for. They're looking for a Messiah, a general who would help them cast out the occupiers. There's just a few miles from Jericho to the west, there's a Riha. There's a Roman garrison where they have all of their troops and their weapons. So what the storyteller is doing, like any good teacher, is starting from where the students are at. They can't start from the conclusion of the story, but this is where they're at. So it just calls to mind the frame of reference that they start with in this story. Now, everything in Mark is written on two levels. One is the phenomenal level, the concrete people and places, ordinary reality. And the other is metaphorical and metaphysical. They are symbols of something beyond what they normally mean. This is the spiritual level. And generally in the Bible, both in the First Testament and the Second Testament, all new things come into Israel from the east. The sun rises in the east, new wisdom comes in from the east. It's the land of beginnings and the source of spiritual wisdom. So we're set up to expect a teaching that builds on the original baptism that Jesus has in the wilderness and that will challenge the conventional wisdom that people are starting with. Now, we are introduced to Bartimaeus, son of Timaeus. Bartimaeus, first of all, it's unusual for anybody to be named. It only happens a couple times in Mark that the person being healed is named, but this is a really unusual name. It's got, Timaeus is not a Jewish name, it's a Greek name, but then it's got this Hebrew prefix, bar. This is the only place in Mark where the name is explained. And it tells us Bar means son of Timaeus. Now, if you're Jewish, you don't need to be told that. You already know that. That's our language. So clearly, this is also being addressed to a Greek audience. Okay. It's a very unusual story in that it's a miracle story, but the protagonist of the story is not Jesus. We get all the information, all the action from Bartimaeus himself. He's really the hero of the story. So who is Timaeus? It is the title of at the time, very well-known Platonic dialogue. It's one of the last dialogues that he wrote. He wrote it at the end of life, and it's his sort of summing up of all of his teachings. It's his cosmology, the evolution of the world is toward God. We're all gradually becoming more God-like. And God is revealed in this development of the human individual. And the two main themes of this book, and I won't go into it all, I'll just say the two main themes of the book is the relationship of the higher self or the soul to the body, the lower self, under the conditions of disease or under the conditions of enlightenment or faith. That's what Plato is dealing with. Now, when we see that Bartimaeus is the son of Timaeus, it's saying this is the new improved Timaeus. This is the next generation. So we can expect, it's promising, it's challenging itself, this story, to present an even more enlightened version than Plato's version. Now, the next part of the sentence, we have a blind beggar. So this person's an expendable. He's an outcast. He's not a productive member of society. He's at the bottom. And so his condition is one of not just physical suffering, but also social isolation. And I think people who have these, especially visible handicaps, blind or lame, or anything like that, often will say that the physical condition it's inconvenient, but the more serious disability, the suffering, comes from how you're treated, how people look at you, how they talk about you. And then the even more serious disability than that is when you're treated that way over a long period of time, you start identifying with it. And so you kind of take on this attitude toward yourself. And that's a really serious disability. And this story deals with all of those things. So he's sitting by the road. Well, as I said, the road's a commercial road, it's a transportation route. But it's not just that. Symbolically, it's the way, it's the road of life, it's the Tao, the path of spiritual development itself, spiritual experience. So it's a metaphor. And Bartimaeus is finding himself on the road, but on the side of the road. He's sort of stuck. And this is his condition. And he's stuck partly because he's blind, but also partly because he's how he's treated and his own sense of disempowerment. Now, I explain all of this. I mean, this is sort of like if this were a scientific article, it'd be like, this is a review of the literature, this is where we start from. But we're not in first century Palestine anymore. And this is why I go to seminary. You don't have to learn all of that stuff. I'm supposed to bring it to you. But you still have the same problem that the people at the time, the people hearing the story had. That is, we have assumptions. We have beliefs. A lot has gone on. We have the Copernican theory of the universe and the Renaissance and Newtonian mechanics, but they are all just beliefs. And that's what we're encumbered by. So if you want to really be open and you want to say, I want my life transformed, it behooves us to do the same thing, to examine our beliefs and see, are they limiting or not? And this story starts out with the whole world. I mean, you have the Hebrew theology and you have the Greek philosophy and mythology. And of course, the Romans, I mean, most of that stuff came from the Greeks for them. And are we blind in some way? That's where we start. So, verse 47, when he heard that it was Jesus of Nazareth, that's his point of departure. He just hears about this guy. Now, maybe he has a reputation, but something moves him. He kind of is able to see the true identity and the true possibility that Jesus represents to him by some force of intuition, by some organ of spiritual possession. Poverty usually grinds people down, but it can also be a position to look at society from a whole new perspective, and it can kind of help you develop spiritually. So when he hears that, he begins to shout. All the people say, oh yeah, shouting. Do you remember how the Battle of Jericho was won? The general, Joshua, said, be quiet, don't say anything, just sit there. And after 7 days, he said, now I'm going to tell you to shout. And you march around that city and you shout in a loud voice. And you remember this Negro spiritual, Joshua fit the battle.
The Battle of Jericho.
Jericho. Yeah. And the walls come tumbling down. Right? Now, there's a miracle worthy of the name. Those, any general will tell you it's a lot tougher to attack a city than it is to defend a city. But here we have, according to the story, the wall collapsed and every man charged in and they took the city. And ever since that time, shouting is a metaphor of spiritual desire, intention, and courage. And it runs all throughout the Psalms. And what does he shout out? He shouts out, Jesus, Son of David. Now, normally, Jesus is called a lot of things like that, the Messiah or the Son of David. Son of David is just a code for Messiah, somebody who's going to rescue us. And normally Jesus will say, no, no, no. He denies that. I'm not the Son of God. I'm the Son of Man. But this is the only time I know of he doesn't do that. He says nothing. And sometimes what you don't say is just as important as what you do say. I take it as, Jesus showing respect to Bartimaeus. You know what? You're a person of faith, and I'll just let that stand. Maybe I can save you, though not in the way you imagine. But we've combined all of the big people of the whole Jewish tradition. Joshua finished up the battle that Moses started, and the Son of David invokes both David and Saul. So we've got the Mount Rushmore of Jesus leaders. So a double whammy. This is exactly what the people want. Now, instead of going through every single verse, how am I doing for time? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and jump to verse 49. Jesus stopped and he said, call him. Now, normally when somebody needs to be healed, Jesus goes to them. He could have just as easily, even more easily, walked over to where Bartimaeus was, just as he did many times before. But he doesn't do that. In this time, he addresses the crowd. Crowd, you call him. He enlists their support. This is a key step because he's saying, you can help. I may need you to help me. It takes a community. Maybe they can't cure physical blindness, but maybe they could address the social rejection that they have going on of him, the way that they rebuke him and cast him aside. Miracles are relational. So they called to the blind man, cheer up, on your feet. He's calling you. Wow. Supportive, encouraging. What a change from where they were just a moment ago. And just like Bartimaeus heard Jesus, Jesus heard something in Bartimaeus. I mean, all the people are calling out. They're all shouting. So he's recognizing something in Bartimaeus that is worthy of stopping. So the crowd did accept Jesus's instruction. And, well, I'll just say, later on, Bartimaeus follows Jesus. It's not clear to me that his physical blindness is healed. So if he's going to be following Jesus, it's going to be through the help of the crowd. They're going to guide him or help him. So this is just kind of foreshadowing that. But this is an example of the social walls of rejection come a-tumbling down. It really harkens back to the Battle of Jericho story, but it's not about physical force and power. It's about social attitudes. This is what social boundaries. Bartimaeus throws his cloak aside. Seems like, I don't know if you noticed that or thought it was important, but he probably was not wearing his cloak. If he's a beggar, the cloak is spread out on the ground. Why? To receive alms.
Mm-hmm.
And it's probably, it's his only heavy duty piece of clothing. It might be the only wealth that he has, but he throws it aside. And this is where he really comes out to Jesus. And there's a lot of associations with this. It's not just his protection and his shelter. It's his means for getting wealth in the future.
Sure.
he's really casting aside all that he owns. And there's another story, not very long before in Mark, where a rich man goes to see Jesus and says, "What do I need to do to get into the kingdom of heaven?" And Jesus says, "Give up everything you have." And he's very disappointed and dejected and walks away. He's not willing to do it. But Bartimaeus does it spontaneously without even being told. He's quite a guy. It's also backshadowing, because to the baptism, what do you do when you get baptized in the Jordan? You take off your clothes so that you're naked before man and God. So this is in effect, he's conducting his own baptism. And he's also casting off, I'm not ashamed. I'm not taking on this social attitudes toward me. I'm casting that off. And it's a big step. It's a big step. It's also foreshadowing, because the next event is Palm Sunday. And what do people do? They take off their garments and cast them on the road for Jesus to come into town. So there's a lot going on in these short stories. But Bartimaeus is the leader. He does it before anyone else does. So Bartimaeus, he jumps to his feet and comes to Jesus. Well, how does he do that? I thought he was blind, right? Well, he's still blind, because it was in the story, he doesn't regain his sight until later. So it must be because the crowd helped. So in some ways, I think that is the real miracle of the story. It's a community miracle, not just individual. 51. What do you want me to do for you? Jesus asked him. Why does he ask this question? Isn't it obvious? I think it's pretty obvious to everybody. But why does he ask this question? Well, there's two reasons. Mark does it because these are exactly, word for word, what Jesus addressed to the disciples. They came to him and he said, "What do you want me to do for you?" James and John asked, well, what we really want, our heart's desire, is we would like to be sitting on your right hand and your left hand when you are in your glory. That is, when you're in heaven.
Didn't you ask?
But I don't get me. I don't know what Jesus says, you have no idea what you're asking for.
What you're asking.
Like, oh my God. Bartimaeus, these are the insiders, right? Bartimaeus, an outsider, knows exactly what he's asking for. So what we are contrasting here are these misguided and ego-based, status-oriented disciples with a poor, blind, enlightened, and faithful beggar. Right? The first shall be last, and the last shall be first. I think there's a second reason, and that is Jesus is saying, you know what, I can tell you're a man of faith, Bartimaeus, you're a man of faith, but it's very important, it's essential for you to express this faith publicly, to press it out of you. It's a very important step in spiritual development, to name it and to claim it, to testify. So again, it all comes back to us again. What would you ask for? Do you know what you're asking for? You know, what is your hopes? What do you think is your obstacle? What's your hopes? What would it take to save you? It raises that question. 7:35. Okay. I will just go back to 52. Well, it's that famous line, you've heard it many times. Go, says Jesus. He's commanding him to walk. figure out a way. That's still not clear to me that it says his sight was regained, but he tells him to walk, and he says, "Your faith has healed you," as he always does. You know, Jesus, there's no action that Jesus takes. There's no in Matthew and Luke, Jesus touches his eyes. You know, they've got to make Jesus do something. I mean, they really completely miss the point of the story. And really, in most of these miracles, the physical disease is not the problem so much as the subjective illness or the treatment of society and your attitude toward yourself, your identification. And the Greek word here, sojain, has healed you. It can refer to both physical healing and salvation. It refers to both physical and spiritual, which is kind of the theme of this whole story. And immediately, kaiuthus, I mean, it's in every miracle, you get to some critical point and it happens in no time at all. That is to say, it happens independently of time and space, okay, a higher dimension. So he receives his sight. Now, this is the answer to Timaeus. This is the new improved version. Plato has the idea that there's the lower self and the higher self, or there's mortal people and there's immortal people. Same idea in Buddhism is that the body dies, but the soul does not die. Okay? That there's a part of us that can see beyond the phenomenal world. And the way I take these miracles is that the Christ within us is able to make contact to the Christ within Jesus. And it's that relationship, not the human one or the body or the visible one, but the spiritual intuitive relationship where the healing power is. And that's what happened. But that's what the son of Timaeus is. That's what Bartimaeus represents.
Mm.
And it says he followed Jesus. Now it's translated, I mean, I have a better translation. It's translated as if in Greek it's aorist. That is, here's the event. Now he followed. He wasn't before. But the Greek verb is imperfect, which means he was following him before, he's following him now, he'll continue to follow in the future. It's a continuing process. It's always been there. He always had this spiritual sight, but it was obscured by his treatment, his identifications, his trauma, all of these things. This is what distracts us and has put us out of touch with our divine self. And that's what's restored in this miracle. And he goes along the road. He goes along the road that could be physically, the Greek phrase, and tedodo, is he's physically going along the road, or he's going on the manner, in the style of, well, who's on the style? He's a disciple. The disciples are going along the road. Now he is too. Now, it looks like a wonderful thing, a healing miracle. Yeah, but where is that road going? Okay. Miracles are not, in some ways, they're a bed of roses, but these roses have thorns.
Yeah.
And that's a point that it depends on your attitude of what you think healing or salvation is. It's not a bed of thornless roses. You know, there's consequences. There's things that will happen to you. It's not an easy road. And you need to know that, be careful what you wish for and what you pray for. But it's a reminder that the salvation is not just an inner possession. It's just not, our faith is not just something that we have ourselves. It has to be expressed. We have to call out, and then we have to go on the road. There's karma involved. There's action involved. And Bartimaeus does it. And that's why he's such a great hero. Okay, that's about half an hour.
That's amazing.